Berlin was burning. The capital of the Third Reich, once filled with parades and banners, was now a skeleton of smoke and rubble. Soviet artillery thundered closer each hour, echoing through the ruins of a city that had worshipped its leader only years before. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in the claustrophobic air of the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler waited. He had built an empire on spectacle, on cameras, on lights, on carefully staged images of power. But now, the man who had ruled through the lens of propaganda was watching his image disintegrate, and somewhere inside that crumbling world, one of his own cameramen refused to stop filming. His name was Walter Frenz, a man once trusted to immortalize Hitler's glory. But in those final days of April 1945, he would become the unintentional witness to its destruction. This is his story, the story of the man who secretly filmed the downfall of Adolf Hitler. The propaganda machine. To understand Walter Frenz, you must first understand the machine that created him. From the earliest days of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler understood the power of image. He knew that victory in the streets began with victory on the screen. Propaganda wasn't decoration, it was weaponry. In the 1930s, Germany became the most filmed nation on earth. Every speech, every rally, every march through the streets of Nuremberg was captured by cameras. Behind those lenses were filmmakers like Leni Riefenstahl, whose monumental film Triumph of the Will transformed Hitler into a near-religious figure. Working beside her was a young cameraman, precise, quiet, and technically brilliant, Walter Frenz. Frenz had studied engineering before joining Riefenstahl's team. He was fascinated by motion, by the mechanics of capturing movement on film. His job was not political. It was artistic, almost scientific. But in Nazi Germany, every image served the same purpose, to glorify the regime. When Hitler saw Riefenstahl's work, he demanded the same perfection for his own appearances. He wanted to be filmed not as a politician, but as destiny itself. Riefenstahl's team, including Frenz, followed him across Germany and beyond, at speeches, in parades, in moments of private triumph. Frenz became one of the few cameramen allowed close to the Führer's inner circle. By 1940, as the war expanded across Europe, Frenz's camera followed the victories. He filmed Hitler greeting cheering crowds in Paris, inspecting troops in Poland, visiting the front in France. To the world, these films showed strength and control. To the German people, they showed a leader untouched by doubt. But as the years passed, the footage began to change. Behind the smiles and handshakes, Frenz's reels started to capture something else. Exhaustion, unease, the slow unraveling of certainty. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The Wehrmacht was retreating, cities were burning, and yet the propaganda ministry demanded more films, more images of hope. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, ordered his cameramen to continue filming the invincibility of the Führer. Frenz's work now took on a strange duality. Officially, he was documenting the regime's strength. Privately, he was witnessing its decay. In 1944, he filmed Hitler inspecting the bombed-out ruins of Berlin. The once confident leader now appeared frail, his hands trembling, his eyes sunken. Frenz captured these moments, though he knew they could never be shown to the public. To reveal weakness was treason. Still, he kept the reels. He could not explain why, only that he felt history was shifting, and someone had to record it. Not for the ministry, not for Hitler, but for truth itself. When the failed assassination attempt on Hitler occurred on July 20, 1944, paranoia consumed the Reich. Goebbels ordered all sensitive material destroyed. Film archives were scrutinized. Cameramen were watched. But Frenz continued working quietly, carefully, filming as instructed, while hiding pieces of footage he believed mattered. In those months, Berlin changed from capital to battlefield. The sound of Allied bombers replaced the parades. The camera that once glorified victory now captured desperation. And as the Allies crossed the Rhine, Hitler ordered his last propaganda film, Kohlberg, a lavish historical epic meant to inspire courage in a defeated nation. Frenz worked on that film too. He watched thousands of soldiers diverted from the front to serve as extras, while real battles were being lost. It was madness, but no one dared to say it aloud. By early 1945, the Red Army was closing in. Hitler refused to leave Berlin. He declared that the city would stand or die with him. Inside the bunker, a handful of loyal aides remained, generals, secretaries, and, among them, his personal cameraman. Walter Frenz now found himself in the center of a tragedy he had spent a decade filming from the edges. He had filmed the rise. Now he would film the fall, the collapse. By April 1945, the Reich was a ruin of its former self. What had once been the beating heart of Nazi power now lay buried under the rubble of its own ambition. Berlin was encircled. The Soviet army was closing in from the east, block by block, house by house. Inside the Führer bunker, the air was thick with smoke and despair. Those who remained were not soldiers anymore, but ghosts of loyalty, men and women too terrified or too proud to leave. Hitler, once obsessed with being seen as the architect of a new world, now hid beneath the earth, dictating orders to divisions that no longer existed. Walter Frenz moved silently among them. He still carried his 35mm film camera, a tool that had once captured rallies and triumphs. Now its purpose had changed. There were no more speeches, no more crowds, only the dim flicker of light bulbs and the scratch of pencils as Hitler's secretaries took dictation. Frenz was no longer filming for the regime. He was filming for history, quietly, discreetly, and at great personal risk. In those final weeks, Hitler insisted that every appearance he made above ground be recorded. He believed that if the German people could see him, they would not lose faith. But when Frenz lifted his camera in the Chancellery Gardens on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the images told another story. The Führer, once radiant with authority, now stood trembling, his left hand shaking uncontrollably, his face pale and sunken. As he greeted a group of Hitler youth, boys barely old enough to hold a rifle, Frenz's lens captured not power, but the ghost of it. This footage would become one of the last public images of Adolf Hitler ever recorded. Behind the camera, Frenz said nothing. He knew the danger. If Goebbels or Bormann suspected that he was keeping reels that showed weakness, he could be executed for treason. But Frenz also knew that the world had to see the truth one day. The truth that even dictators fall. As the Soviet guns grew louder, panic seeped into the bunker. Rations ran low. Sleep came rarely. Reports from the front grew shorter each hour. Goebbels promised Hitler that Berlin would hold, but everyone knew it was a lie. Frenz kept his camera hidden, shooting when he could, capturing fragments of what life had become underground. The fear, the exhaustion, the whispered arguments that erupted into shouting matches. Each reel he exposed was a silent act of rebellion against the very propaganda he had once served. Above them, the city was unrecognizable. Civilians fled through burning streets. Buildings collapsed as artillery shells rained down. Still, the propaganda ministry kept operating, printing newspapers that spoke of victory through sacrifice. It was an empire of delusion, and Frenz's camera was the only witness that refused to lie. One night, as the sound of Soviet tanks echoed nearby, Goebbels ordered that all remaining film archives be destroyed. The order was absolute. No trace of weakness, no record of defeat must survive. Dozens of assistants began hauling reels of film into the courtyard, pouring gasoline over them, setting them alight. Years of footage turned to ash in minutes. Frenz watched silently, heart pounding. He had spent half his life behind those images, framing history, creating illusion. Now he saw it vanish in flames, but not everything burned. Hidden beneath crates and inside false walls, Frenz had concealed parts of his collection, private reels, fragments of Hitler's final days, and the faces of those who lived with him underground. He risked his life to save them, smuggling small canisters through the chaos, hiding some in Berlin's basements, others with trusted friends outside the city. Every camera he touched, every frame he preserved, became a defiance of the system he had once served. On April 29th, the Soviets were less than a mile away. Explosions rocked the bunker. Hitler spent the day drafting his political testament, naming his successors, and blaming everyone but himself for Germany's ruin. Frenz continued to film what he could, the corridors littered with documents, the silent meals, the secretaries crying in corners. Then, on April 30th, it ended. Hitler shot himself in his private room beside Eva Braun. The news spread through the bunker like a whisper and then a scream. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years had survived barely 12. In the hours that followed, the surviving staff began to flee. Some tried to escape through the sewers. Others surrendered to the Soviets. Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. Frenz knew the Soviets would soon reach the bunker. If they found him with film, they might assume he was part of the propaganda effort, or worse, they might destroy the reels entirely. So he made his final decision. He gathered the surviving footage, placed it in sealed canisters, and slipped away through the ruins of Berlin. It was the most dangerous journey of his life. Soviet patrols controlled most of the streets, and the city was burning from end to end. Frenz disguised himself as a civilian, carrying the reels hidden beneath his clothes. He moved through smoke and rubble, across bridges that no longer existed, through gunfire that echoed like thunder. Somehow, he survived. Days later, he reached a safe zone under Allied control and surrendered. When he was searched, the film canisters were discovered, but instead of being destroyed, they were handed to investigators and archivists. Among them were the last authentic images of Hitler's final days and the dying breath of the Nazi regime. Those reels, grainy, haunting, incomplete, would become priceless historical records. They showed not the grandeur of the Reich, but its decay. They revealed not the myth of invincibility, but the frailty of the man behind it. Walter Frenz's secret footage had survived. He had not set out to be a hero nor a whistleblower. He was simply a man with a camera, standing in the ashes of history, unwilling to let it disappear unrecorded. The secret footage, WWII. When the guns finally fell silent over Berlin, the city was no longer a capital. It was a graveyard. Thousands of buildings were reduced to dust. Smoke still hung over the horizon. The once proud monuments of the Reich lay shattered, their flags burned, their symbols erased. In the ruins of this fallen empire, Allied soldiers searched for proof. They wanted to understand what had really happened inside Hitler's bunker, who had survived, who had died, and how the most powerful regime in Europe had collapsed so completely. Among the items recovered were reels of film, scattered across the wreckage of Nazi ministries. Some were charred, some water-damaged, some entirely blank, but a few were intact, and one small collection carried Walter Frenz's mark. At first, the Allies didn't know what they had found. To them, it was just another box of German propaganda material. But when the films were developed, the truth flickered to life on the screen. There was Hitler standing in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. There were the shattered ruins of Berlin behind him. And there, beside him, were frightened teenagers in Hitler Youth uniforms, shaking his hand, saluting as bombs fell in the distance. The footage was short, less than a minute long, but it was enough. For the first time, the world could see the dictator not as a towering figure of authority, but as a frail, trembling man. It was the final image of Adolf Hitler alive, and it came from the camera of Walter Frenz. Over the next few years, more of Frenz's footage began to surface. Archivists traced some of it to hidden caches across Germany, in attics, in film laboratories, in forgotten containers buried beneath debris. Each reel told part of the story the Nazis had tried to erase. There were scenes of Berlin's streets in chaos, citizens fleeing through smoke. Clips of Goebbels giving his final press conferences, his voice hollow with desperation. And fragments of daily life inside the bunker, faces pale with exhaustion, men staring blankly into the camera, knowing the end was near. It was more than history. It was confession on film. For decades, much of this footage remained locked in archives, studied only by historians. But in time, it found its way into documentaries, newsreels, and museums. Every frame became evidence, not of propaganda, but of truth. Walter Frentz, once one of the regime's chosen cameramen, had inadvertently become the man who documented its death. His hidden reels preserved what no one else dared to show, the moment when myth met mortality. For historians, his work was invaluable. Through his lens, they could see the collapse not just of an army, but of an illusion. The Nazi regime had built its identity on spectacle, mass rallies, shining uniforms, perfect choreography. But Frentz's secret footage stripped all of that away. It revealed the fear, the confusion, the exhaustion of a regime facing its own extinction. Some questioned Frentz's motives. Was he driven by conscience, or simply by a filmmaker's instinct to record? He never claimed to be a hero. In interviews after the war, he spoke carefully, avoiding moral judgments. He said he had only done what he always did. He filmed what was in front of him, yet even in that simplicity lies something extraordinary. In a time when the regime demanded lies, he chose to preserve the truth, even if he didn't speak it aloud. His footage also helped confirm the authenticity of other records from the final days. When Soviet investigators released their own photographs of Hitler's remains, many in the West doubted them. But Frentz's films, showing the bunker's interiors, the layout of the rooms, and the people present in the final week, helped verify the accounts that followed. In one reel, a short clip showed a corridor littered with papers, official documents scattered like snow across the floor. That single image became symbolic, the paperwork of tyranny reduced to chaos, the bureaucracy of evil collapsing under its own weight. For years, fragments of Frentz's film appeared in exhibitions and documentaries. Each piece offered a glimpse into a moment that no one had dared to capture. Historians began calling his work the accidental truth. He had been part of the machine, but in its final moments, he became its mirror. After the war, Frentz was interrogated by the Allies. They knew his name, his association with Riefenstahl, and his proximity to Hitler. He was questioned about propaganda, about his loyalty, about whether he had filmed executions or atrocities. Frentz denied any involvement in such crimes, and there was no evidence to suggest otherwise. He was eventually released. In the years that followed, he lived quietly, rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. He worked as a photographer and lecturer, teaching about film technique and visual storytelling, the same craft that had once served a dictator. But historians never forgot him. His name appeared in footnotes, archives, and documentaries as the man who captured Hitler's final images. For all the propaganda he had once filmed, it was those few hidden reels, fragile, imperfect, and raw, that secured his place in history. The irony is impossible to ignore. Walter Frentz began his career by helping to build a myth. He ended it by helping to destroy one. His footage became a reminder of the dual power of the camera, to deceive and to reveal. It showed that truth can survive even in the hands of those who once served falsehood. Through those surviving reels, the world saw Hitler not as a godlike figure from propaganda posters, but as a broken man staring into the abyss of his own creation. The empire of spectacle had ended, but the man who secretly filmed its downfall ensured that we would never forget how it looked when it crumbled. The aftermath. When the war ended, Germany was divided not just by borders but by memory. Every film, every photograph, every document was evidence in a vast effort to understand how a civilized nation had followed a man into catastrophe. The camera, once a weapon of propaganda, was now an instrument of truth. For Walter Frentz, that truth was complicated. He was never charged with war crimes. He had not taken part in executions or produced the hateful propaganda that poured from Goebbels' ministry. But he had worked for the system. His lens had helped construct the image of Hitler as a savior, a myth that seduced millions. After his release from Allied custody, Frenz retreated into silence. He lived quietly in West Germany, taking freelance photography work, teaching cinematography and restoring old films. He avoided interviews, rarely speaking about his years inside the Reich. When he did, his tone was clinical, almost detached, as though he were describing a technical exercise, not a chapter of moral darkness, yet his name lingered in the archives. Historians studying Nazi imagery could not ignore him. His signature appeared on reels that captured both the height of Hitler's power and the moment of its collapse. He was the continuity between the rise and the fall. As post-war Germany rebuilt itself, Frenz's surviving footage resurfaced in newsreels and documentaries. In the 1950s and 1960s, television audiences in Britain and America saw the trembling figure of Hitler greeting the Hitler Youth. They saw the bunker corridors strewn with papers, the ruins of the Chancellery, the faces of those who had stayed to the end. Viewers were stunned. The footage did something propaganda never intended. It humanized the dictator, and in doing so, destroyed his legend. Gone was the commanding orator of the rallies. What remained was a frail man consumed by fear, standing in the ruins of his own empire. That single image changed how people imagined the end of the war. It stripped away the myth of invincibility that Hitler's propaganda had spent years constructing, and it came from the same camera that once glorified him. Walter Frenz's legacy is one of paradox. He was both witness and participant, both craftsman and captive of his time. He helped stage the illusions of the Third Reich, yet also preserved the fragments that exposed its reality. Historians have debated his intentions for decades. Was he simply obeying orders until the end? Or did he, in those last weeks, feel a quiet obligation to record the truth? The answer may never be clear, but his actions ensured that the world could see the Reich's final moments. Without the veil of myth, the reels he saved became part of the permanent record of the 20th century. They are studied in universities, displayed in museums, and featured in nearly every documentary about Hitler's last days. Without them, our visual understanding of that moment would be incomplete. More than 70 years later, his work still raises difficult questions. What is the responsibility of those who record history? Can a filmmaker working for evil redeem himself by revealing the truth? Does intent matter, or only what remains on film? Frenz never answered publicly. He lived until 2004, passing away at the age of 94. To the end, he insisted that he had simply been a cameraman, nothing more, nothing less. But history saw him differently. He was the man whose lens outlived the lies it once served, the lens that refused to lie. In the end, Walter Frenz's story is not about loyalty or rebellion. It is about the endurance of truth. The regime he served built its power on images, on manipulation, on the careful crafting of spectacle. But when that regime collapsed, it was the same medium, film, that exposed its decay. The camera does not believe ideology. It records light, shadow, and motion. It captures reality, whether its owner intends to or not. In those final days beneath Berlin, when orders demanded that every reel be destroyed, one man chose instead to preserve what he saw. He could have burned it all. He could have erased the evidence and walked away unnoticed. But he didn't. He carried it through fire, through gunfire, through the ruins of a dying world. Decades later, when historians unspooled those reels, they found not just the face of a dictator, but the truth of a moment humanity needed to remember. A reminder that no illusion, no empire, no propaganda can outlast the reality it tries to hide. Walter Frenz filmed Hitler's downfall, but he also filmed the downfall of deception itself. His camera, once a servant of lies, became a witness to truth, and perhaps that is the quiet redemption of the man who secretly filmed the end of a nightmare.